Nonsense. We might think that nonsense can be written off with negative connotations and its use as a weighted statement, but I disagree. People listen religiously to Hendrix's noisy feedback or a prophet speaking in tongues to hear the call of a living God. Why do we memorize the words to Carol's Jabberwocky? I think the answer lies in revolutionary desire. For a brief overview, I'm going to start off going over some of the theories I use to explain nonsense and link it to revolution. Then I'm going to go through the three texts of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland Through the Looking Glass, Tristan Tzara's Vent sans que un posies, and Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, explaining how each of them use nonsense and the problems with each. To begin, I think that nonsense plays a very important role in the construction of language. On the screen right now is Umberto Eco's model of a metaphor as taken from Aristotle. We see that the first element D relates to the second element A through some kind of interpretant I. Basically how this works, for example, I say that the woman is like a birch. A birch is flexible and the woman is flexible. And so the interpretant would be the quality of flexibleness. We see how this model of a metaphor is in itself kind of nonsensical and implies a certain disconnect. Obviously, a birch is not a woman, but we use things by what they are not to explain and define things. You open up a dictionary and you see that other words are being used to describe words. Language itself, very importantly, works as metaphor. Saussure describes how a tree is described with the word tree, not because it bears some kind of likeness to a tree, but because the word tree is not a tree, and the word tree is not different words like girl. Now, Eco says that in order to form these interpretants and these associations, we require certain codes, basically the set of connotations that we have within a given society and within language for how concepts relate to one another. These are both informed by popular metaphors and also help us to create the metaphors, so it's kind of a circular process. One other theory that is very important is the Lacanian notion of the mirror stage. This occurs when the infant in his stage of development looks at the mirror and for the first time recognizes his or her own reflection. Previous to this point, the child has had a very subjective, idealized version of what they were as they experienced it inside their head, but when they experience the mirror, they realize that they exist outside of their own head. They are an externalized being, an imago, as opposed to the idealized ego, that sense of self, without thinking of the self as an external being. They realize that they exist just as their mother or father and exist within this whole entire world of psychosexual issues. There is a disconnect because they realize that the external image does not reflect exactly their idealized image of what they are. So there is a desire to represent their external self as their internal self. This causes the individual to engage in external structures like language, but may also offer an avenue for capitalism to prey on these individuals' desire for their internal ego ideal to manifest in the externalized self. Adorno talks particularly on this subject. To quote, "Men become objects that can be manipulated without further objection and thus fall far behind the potential which lies in the technical forces of production. But since as subjects men themselves still represent the ultimate limit of reification, mass culture must try and take hold of them again and again. Capitalism oppresses people, and the individuals are able to feel themselves as individuals outside of the capitalist system, but as soon as they claim an identity for themselves, capitalism is able to commodify towards this kind of identity and start the cycle all over again of selling to this identity. In order to escape this kind of cycle, we need nonsense. What we need is a more schizophrenic kind of identity in order to find the individual which cannot be sold to and commoditized under the capitalist system. As Lacan explains schizophrenia, it occurs when, instead of attempting to balance the external self with the ego ideal, the individual rejects the mirror image and produces the real within their own consciousness. The objective nonsense is schizoid, and it does not represent the perspectives in language which the individual feels internally. Therefore, nonsense language is inherently schizophrenic. J.M. Bernstein, in his introduction to Adorno's essay, states, fragmentary writing is premised upon the refusal of the operations that establish rational connections between states in their theoretical discourse, and their linguistic representatives. For Adorno, these operations are the markers for domination in the conceptual realm. Historical truth is shown in fragmentary writing, which does not explicitly aim to demonstrate or to explain. Explaining and demonstrating neutralize the phenomena in question. Basically, when we use nonsense speech, when we break up speech, we deny the external with representation of the internal self, and therefore are able to create new systems of order which better represent our internal self. To see how this manifests in nonsense literature, let's look to our first text, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. To give some backstory, Lewis Carroll idealized this quality of apparent purity in little girls who live in what he called the happy hours of childhood, when all is new and fair, and when sin and sorrow are but names, empty words signifying nothing. The construction of concepts like sin in a capitalist system works to keep women in line with societal patriarchal control. The question of how these orders manifest in Carroll's writing becomes tendentious. David Holbrook interprets Jabberwocky the poem as representative of an archetypal story going back to Sumerian myth. Depictions of the Jabberwock's face suggest vaginal dentata, a powerful castration threat posed by female control of sexuality. The man of the poem warns his son of the dangerous Jabberwock, and the son goes out in the poem to slay the monster. The son in the poem does slay with the blade, representing the phallus, and men in the poem regain control. Thus, the myth tells Alice, as she reads it, that she must submit to societal patriarchal control, that if she were to be a powerful sexual figure like the Jabberwock, she can only be destroyed by the more powerful phallus. An interesting complication presents itself when Alice first finds this poem, as it's backwards and she needs to hold it up to a mirror to read. Likewise, the whole world of Wonderland and the looking glass which Alice encounters in the books exist as a mirror to the real world, often containing certain aspects of the real world in dreamlike form, such as the Mad Queen's focus on capital punishment, or the ending dinner scene of Through the Looking Glass, which is often interpreted as representative of a sexual orgasm. But all these events take place within the frames of the mirror. Umberto Eco had something to say about signs presented in mirrors when he said, "The mirror image cannot be correlated to a content. If the interpretability is an inherent feature of the content, an image without content cannot by definition be interpreted. Therefore, these orders and warnings which exist in the Looking Glass world are rendered useless, since they cannot be interpreted by Alice, and the nonsense of such a world enables Alice to become free of the patriarchal control and sexual confinement which exists outside of the mirror. She is able to find a way to not have to interpret the codes and orders of the patriarchal phallic control and the symbolic order." That said, I think it's telling that the images I'm using here come from the Disneyfication of Alice. Were I to use, for example, Svinkmacher's adaptation, I don't think it would be nearly as recognizable. The Disney Alice reproduced the Alice figure, but Bowdlerized it, produced it into something which no longer poses a threat to the social order. Alice in the original books is depicted rather phallically, often growing and shrinking at various points, and shown in this image to look very phallic. This suggests a kind of subversion to be found in Wonderland of the phallic order, wherein the female can have the phallus, which is very threatening to a patriarchal dominated society. In the Disney adaptation, these qualities are diminished, and instead, when she grows and shrinks, we are given an upskirt shot which directly sexualizes Alice. When she plays croquet in the movie with the flamingo, she must seduce it into maintaining an erection with its neck so that she can hit the croquet ball. Her struggle is not to avoid the social order, but to become more womanly and sexual and incorporate herself in the social order, which I think has gained a sexualization of Alice contrary to Carroll's original intent, which has made it so that Alice can now be sold into the patriarchal order once again. About 2 decades after the movie came out, pornos were made of Alice in Wonderland. Whatever revolution she had by posing a threat to the sexual order is now quashed. In our second text, we look at Tristan Tzara's 25 et une poésies, or 25 in 1 poems. Tzara was writing during the Dada period in Zurich, where words were paired disparately in order to make poems. He instructed readers to cut words out of a newspaper and reassemble them at random to write poems. His actual poetry relies on a subversion of an audience's attempt to listen to the poems, containing disconnected French phrases and syllables which sound like French words, but attempting to follow the words only leads to disconnection. Some sounds attempted to imitate machinery, and often in performances, many poems in different languages were read at once, confusing listeners. Their poems call for an end to sense and the commodification of beauty in poetry, using grotesque and violent imagery to shock audiences with vulgarity. They attempt to deconstruct the hold languages, codes, and meanings have on the embodiment of life and identity. Tzara claimed Dada was born of a moral need, an implacable will to achieve a moral absolute, of a profound sentiment that man, at the center of all creations of the spirit, must affirm his primacy over notions emptied of all substance, over dead objects and ill-gotten gains. That said, their conception of sound poems and attempt to reach this declaration of nonsense relies on a primitivist understanding of African culture, confining the African individual into the noble savage stereotype. They often appropriated whole African poems and published them as nonsensical sound poems, and think that doing so gets them closer to some primal humanity, a concept which benefits colonial power structures. Dada artists claim to be against colonialism and often wrote poems as such, but their treatment of African culture confines it into the dichotomy of otherness, replicating these structures of oppression and denying legitimate cultural communication. Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, on the other hand, tries something different. Gertrude Stein's nonsense existed as a feminine opposition to standard modernist masculine stereotypes of the savant, obscure artist, people like James Joyce or Ezra Pound. While these male poems contain obscured references to philosophy and myth, and often utilize polylinguistic utterances to either root their sayings in some kind of intricate, defined system, or to attempt to confuse readers, Stein's language manages to be even more confusing, with both a lack of reliance on history and with a very simple English. Let's look at this first quote from Tender Buttons. A carafe, that is, a blind glass, a kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color and an arrangement in a system to pointing. All this and not ordinary, not unordered and not resembling. The difference is spreading. I feel inclined to read this in reference to the semiotic arguments I've made throughout this thesis, but it seems like I'm imposing my own kind of sense on Stein's language. Lisa Ruddick claims that Stein's language results in a polysemous gathering of meanings. Her words purposefully aim at multiple interpretations and potentially embody a stereotypically feminine display of childbirth. Whether or not Stein meant to extend these codified gender norms or was subverting them, her language does more to leave readers with an intuitive, self-constructed meaning, while leaving any singular intended definition or authorial intent beyond possible understanding. The more one reads Tender Buttons, the less they can hold on to whatever they think their self-constructed meaning, and the more the words become stripped of codification, existing now for their own sake and the way that words connect with each other in its system. That said, this obscures any potential for revolution, as revolution must be embodied in the external world. Adorno criticizes this kind of writing as being so innocuous as to leave no room for the scandal. What is intended to be nothing but a dream leaves reality unharmed, however damaged its image. Were there any revolutionary merit to Stein's push against the reader's ability to construct sense and ability to interact with the external, Adorno takes it away by quoting Friedrich Hegel, who says, "The sole work and deed of universal freedom is thus death, a death that has no inner significance or fulfillment. Such revolution is one which drives the individual towards ultimate death and nothingness." In conclusion, we see that these three texts attempt to find revolution for nonsense, but manage to fail through either the reproduction of revolution into a fetish, the accidental reproduction of oppressive structures of power, or an inaccessibility of the actual revolutionary content. I think these criticisms could be swapped between these three texts or any other text or attempt at revolution, because these problems lie in the very structures of revolution. Baudrillard talks about these issues with revolution taking place in the marketplace of ideas when he says, "To a system whose argument is oppression and repression, the strategic resistance is the liberating claim of subjecthood. But this strategy is more reflective of the earlier phase of the system, and even if we are still confronted with it, it is no longer the strategic terrain. The current argument of the system is to maximize speech, the maximum production of meaning. All the movements that only play on liberation, emancipation, on the resurrection of a subject of history, do not see that they are going in the direction of the system, whose imperative today is precisely the overproduction and regeneration of meaning and of speech. Either you attempt to enact a revolution and serve the dominant orders through synthesis's inevitable devaluation of the other, or the sustaining of the marketplace of ideas, or you exist entirely apart from the external influence of current standings and have no say in a possibility for influence in revolution. Either way, since nonsense can only be read through the lens of language and the marketplace of ideas, any utterance, sensical or nonsensical, is commodity. What could once have been revolutionary in reasoned response or unreasoned gibberish has been bowdlerized and sold in the nostalgic narrative of ideology. I would like to finish with one more quote from Baudrillard. They, the animals, do not speak. In a universe of increasing speech, of the constraint to confess and to speak, only they remain mute, and for this reason they seem to retreat far from us, behind the horizon of truth. But it is what makes us intimate with them. It is not the ecological problem of survival that is important, but still and always that of their silence. In a world bent on doing nothing but making one speak, in a world assembled under the hegemony of signs and discourse, their silence weighs more and more heavily on our organization of meaning. Overcoming capitalism lies not in coming up with a response, but removing oneself from the influences capitalism has had on our internal being. Such a response as Baudrillard's here could be seen as a kind of defeat, and Baudrillard himself claims to being a nihilist about it all. This kind of response would be an admittance to being unable to dismantle capitalism, but with its unstable nature, capitalism cannot sustain itself. At the end, I wonder at the response of someone like Nietzsche, who advocates for the individual will above nihilism, but also recognizes that the highest self exists in isolation.